I seem to recognize most of you, so welcome back to day 2 of the Scott Jenson lecture service. So this is a very different talk. This is a very personal talk where I just had this hunch that video games were quite unique and special, and I really wanted to explore, what it meant, and not to make games, but let me just back up for a little bit. I work on the future Android UX team. We're called the FAUX team, as I mentioned yesterday, and we're encouraged to kind of create these new exploration decks. So this is where this came from. And there's a lot of things happening in Google about different types of products, and haven't really absorbed this kind of huge cultural movement that is gaming. This is actually live streaming gaming tournaments. I don't know if you're familiar with those. They're especially popular in South Korea. But they're becoming quite popular elsewhere. These are the whole X Games type of stuff that's really quite amazing. So it's a cultural phenomenon, but we're not really talking about what is happening within those games themselves. So this talk is not about gamification. There have been tons of books written on this. It was quite popular around 2012, for everything from badges to all sorts of stuff, and you can find tons of talks about it. This is not about that, especially in light of what is happening with overuse of technology and people getting sucked into inappropriate use. Right? So, remember that? I actually argue that gamification is actually the wrong way to think about games. It actually encourages the wrong behavior. So the question really, to me, what started was how do video games actually approach user experience? If you do any kind of search about video games and design, you'll likely come up with this concept of juicy. Juicy is a term I quickly discovered that is used quite actively in the video game community. And it's about this idea of making the game kind of give more visually out than you put in. And so imagine just even a simple pinball game. The old pinball games just had the ball flying, but now the pinball games have vibration, wiggling, explosions, animations. Some of these games are quite outrageous. And so the hot topic right now is this juiciness, but that's really about, I think, just making the game like visually interesting. And that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And another question I wanted to explore was just this idea of how are games and applications different? So has anybody played, by the way, Breath of the Wild? Just curious how many gamers we have here. It is like the best game ever. Okay, I played it all the way in. I love that game. Games create tension, right? You need to beat this monster. You have so much health, you've got so many weapons, and the whole purpose of the game is to give you this challenge, right? But the whole purpose of user experience is to get rid of challenge. So a user experience designer if you were to say to a user experience designer, how would you beat this monster, right? You'd have a button, right? I mean, that's what application design is about, right? It's about removing tension. So I approached this with this kind of almost impossibility. It's like games are completely diametrically opposed to applications. Of course they have nothing to do with each other. So I came into this very skeptical. And so how do we kind of resolve this kind of paradox of this desire for things to be interactive and visual and interesting versus this idea for complete simplicity? So I wanted to explore that. And I started by just asking an email. This is one of the really advantages of working at Google. We have this gigantic mailing list of people. I just said, like, who's been doing game psychology, or give me your favorite, video game teaching examples. And I got just huge numbers of feedback to people. And I ended up just talking to various folks and having coffees and so forth, because a lot of people have worked on it. And they all pointed me to this guy. So I strongly encourage this book. It's called The Theory of Fun, which someone pointed out is like the perfect title to tell you not to have fun, right? Because you have a theory of it. And he is what you a self-described game grammarian. He tries to understand the structure of games. He takes them apart. And this book was written for game designers. So this is the guy who did the original Optima Online. He also did Star Wars, the online Star Wars game. Some really famous big games from the 90s and early 2000s. So he's very well known as a successful game designer, and then he wrote this book. So I was able to get a little bit of money. I hired him as a contractor, and we discussed I read his book, which I highly recommend, And I went through his book trying to talk about how we could apply it to application design specifically. I don't want to make games. I want to make applications, but I want to learn from what games have done. It's quite equivalent to the book Understanding Comics, if you're familiar with that book. It's very much in the same idea. It's a book almost written in a game-like way to talk about games, and Understanding Comics was a comic about comics. So there's a nice little parallel between the two. It also is similar to, I hope, which was this book about the illusions of life. It was a book that came out in the 80s that kind of diagrammed and took apart what animation was. It was the first book to articulate how Disney squashed things much more than they happened in real life, to kind of imply certain emotion and certain kind of speed and certain kind of depth to it. So Disney kind of was able to take apart and create these pieces of animation and then put it together in this book that everybody then copied. This was a very influential book about how to do animation, and that was kind of what I thought my goal was going to be. I thought I was going to talk to this master and come up with these 8 things that you can do, and your application is amazing. So this talk, in a sense, is kind of my journey, my very painful journey through misunderstandings. I had completely the wrong attitude. I was completely misunderstood what he was trying to do, and this conversation over and over and over again would be like, well, Raph, apps can't do this because of this. And he's like, well, Scott, and then he'd completely like destroy my argument. So I'm kind of sharing kind of the learnings that I went through on this. So my first assumption was that games are full of cool tricks for us to copy, like heads-up displays. So Horizon Zero Dawn, has anybody played Horizon Zero Dawn? Oh, you guys are no fun at all. Okay. This is another really awesome game. It's just really got some really cool things to it. But it is this game that has this kind of idea of a heads-up display, and it just feels cool, right? We definitely want to think, how would we use this in our designs, in AR and so forth? And, or there's this idea of variable rewards. This is Super Mario Kart. Has anybody played Super Mario Kart? Thank you. Okay, fine. This has a very clever psychological thing, which is, I don't know, maybe the further behind you are, the better your prizes are. If you're in front, you get crap prizes. If you're in the back, you get these really cool ones that knock people out. So they do that to load balance the game, right? So very intentional game design. So this pointed out to me this idea that game design doesn't have to be graphical, right? It can actually be structural like that. Or the fact that there's these very, very clever things called assist mode right now, which is not only interesting for people with disabilities and so forth, but also just for younger players or people who just don't want to have to kind of if they wanted the challenge to be a little bit lower. It's a whole way of playing the game with just an extra level of kind of guardrails on the game, and they'd have much stronger prompts and so forth. A very interesting idea of how you want to assist people through games. A lot of really clever things. So this is where I was going back to my Disney book of it. I thought I was going to just collect a bunch of tricks and say, let's do heads-up displays, let's do assist mode, let's do this. And Raph's really strongly discouraged me from doing this, because he goes, this toolkit of what games are doing is constantly changing. We could do this, it might be valuable, but he wanted to really deconstruct how games are built. And he felt that was a much more powerful thing because it would allow us to invent new techniques, not just copy what games have been doing. My second assumption is that games are linear and plot-driven that force learning in ways that you can't. So we've played the Uncharted series. I'll stop asking so I don't embarrass you guys. But in the Uncharted series, you will the game will force you into a cavern, and you can't go anywhere but up this particular wall. And if you don't do it, eventually it starts giving you hints and prompts, and eventually it just says, just climb the damn wall. And so if you get stuck, the plot clearly indicates how to tell you what to do. So I was like, see, we can't do that. We've got Google Docs, and you have 18 possible things that you can do at any one time. You can't force the user into a corner. And so that was the example of Uncharted. And his point was, yes, of course, at a superficial level, games do have this plot device. But he goes, there's so much more that what games are trying to do at a much more subtle level, teaching you techniques, that's masking kind of the more nuanced thing that they're doing. And so the third assumption is that players work and practice at games. They enjoy failing. They enjoy getting killed 1,000 times by the same monster, and that's the whole challenge. With apps, no way. If you can't print a document the computer sucks and you're just mad and you walk away. He laughed in my face when I told him that. He goes, do you understand that the vast majority of games fail? It's only the very best games that get people to do that. How does the game encourage and reward and make you feel that you are capable of doing it, that it's worth the effort, that it's possible to actually beat the monster? He goes, that doesn't happen because it's a game, it happens because it's a great game. And so what makes a great game? And I'm like, okay, I really got him riled up on this one. So that's what was the first big learning for me, is it's not about the cool tricks. It's not about creating the Disney book of animation techniques. It's about this idea of how games are built. So here are the 6 things that I will be talking about, give you a little bit of structure. And I'm going to go through each one of these. These are like, now, his book has many, many more of these things. So I'm giving you a much more condensed summary. So I don't want to imply this is everything in his book. But these are the 6 that we kind of really took apart and we feel apply to application design, website design, and so forth. So, and I'm going to go through this actually 2 times. I'm going to go through it once purely from the game theory point of view, and then I'm going to go through the exact same 6 one more time, giving examples from Android. Not that Android is anything special, but I want to ground these principles and things we can do. So, big warning, I mean, I totally understand that games are not the same as Android and that, or any other platform you want to use. I'm not trying to equate these at all, but at the same time, I'm not trying to create this checklist of things to do. I just think we need to talk about how games approach things and how apps approach things, and it's worthwhile to talk about. And by the way, stepping outside of my talk for a second, I know there's a group here talking about games, and so part of me thinks this is just a fledgling idea that just needs a lot more work and a lot more criticism, and so I'd be happy to discuss this with you guys afterwards, because I think this is just the first inklings of this idea. It needs to be discussed further. So let's just start with, say, just try to see things differently. When I pitched this at Google, an awful lot of the Android programmers were a bit skeptical, and this slide was meant for them to say, let's just try to expose ourselves to a bunch of new ideas. So the first point, point 1, is this idea of story versus narrative. And the idea behind this is that at first I was really surprised that he called out the word story different from narrative. They seemed quite similar to me. He was really adamant about this. This is probably what makes him a game grammarian. He's really quite a stickler. The idea that the story is what the author tells. This is the kind of thing that you want the user to experience. The narrative is kind of what you experience. So the author has a whole series of events that they put in order that is kind of their story. And they expect you to follow it in a series of events. The narrative is effectively what the player does, their personal path through that. This could be reading a book and you really, really liked this chapter and you skipped over this chapter. It could be a Disney park where you kind of go through various things. But the difference is that this is the story that the player tells after the fact. And the examples that he was giving here was, okay, so it's about players' agency, how they move through a sequence of events that compels them, they're excited by this, that compels them to tell their own story. And this really varies quite a bit between a movie, which is extremely highly detailed and has a very, very strong story, to sports, which has no story whatsoever. It just has a series of rules. And his claim is this applied to all of them. So the user narrative through a movie is how you interpret it. So a really simple, simplistic adventure movie doesn't have much more interpret. Like there's a bad guy, there's a good guy, the good guy wins. That's, you don't really argue. But really great movies where you argue over it actually are much more interesting. They create more interesting narratives. So that's an example of how story and narrative can be different. So with video games, there's an added element. You can choose. You can kind of choose different paths through the story, and that creates a different narrative. To this day, my son and I, my middle son, talk about the time when he was playing World of Warcraft and he was being attacked by a particular person, and he used this very clever way of being invisible and crouching behind, and the person walked right past him. And the fact that I was with him during that moment and we could talk about it has created something that is now significantly bigger than the game itself. It's a story that we like to share. As I mentioned before, Disneyland also understands how the people physically choose to go interact it. And of course, with sports, it's all about the history and the retelling. People love, after a really great match happens, to retell what had happened and what it did. So people own these experiences long after the fact. So the key point is, it's not the story, it's the arc. It's the actual journey. And that's really critical, because going back to apps, think in terms of standalone features. Have we added GPS? Have we added stars to the markers and maps? Have we added bus directions? You know, we just tick off these features. There's a big long list of things. Whereas games think of it as a higher level. It's a system. And these things fit together that the user has to experience. It's just a very different mindset. And this leads kind of to the next, oh, and so let me tell you the story about this. The original Macintosh was built in 1984 in a world where computers did, when you turn a computer on, it did the same thing. You turn on the switch and it made a sound. Bing, that's all computers did. And then along came the Mac. And people sometimes, this is where I'm going to sound like an old guy, but people don't realize why the Mac kind of blew people's minds, because it just didn't turn on and beep, right? It strung together a series of events and it created a story. Turning on the computer was a story. And so the example here was, unlike, say, Raspberry Pi or Linux or DOS, which would basically give you a screen like this, right? And especially if you had a Linux-based system, there'd be the scrolling list of text of things. You're basically seeing all the plumbing, right, as it came up. The Mac was like, no, 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 no. Welcome. Hi. I'm friendly. It intentionally kind of blocked all that. It pulled a screen over it and said, here's your experience. But then it actually completed the journey. After you booted, the file bar just showed up, and these things showed up. So in a sense, even though it took a long time to boot, it took like 2 minutes for the Macintosh to boot, which was kind of sad, but that's how powerful computers back then are not. The very first thing that you saw was a promise of what you were going to see. It was very intentional that the boot screen looked like this, because you eventually filled it in after the fact. But then there was the attention to detail. I don't know if you see this corner here. These are just little blacked out pixels. And you can't see it very well because the screen is white. So if I make it black, do you see how it rounds the corners out? It just makes it softer. It was, again, part of the story. This isn't a computer screen. This is a desktop. And back in 1984, these were popular. I don't know if you guys remember these things. They're these leather desktop blotters. So it was mirrored off of what was popular at the time, which is these leather rounded corner things that were kind of on your desk that you'd use for writing. So they mirrored that physical thing to give, again, that deeper illusion. And of course, it had a trash can that bulged to kind of give a physical thing. And so in a sense, the Mac story arc was this idea of the sound. Of course, it made the sound when you turn it on, but it had the promise. It then had a deeper model, and it had the depth of interaction after the fact. It all kind of tied together. And it's kind of hard to appreciate how much that created a kind of a trust in the system. This thing that was like, if it goes to this level of detail to tell me the story, I'm going to kind of hang around for a little bit. So users work at a level above us. Independent of what we do, they will create narrative through random, unconnected pieces of our product. Games, though, and this is the fundamental philosophical difference, work hard to build reinforcing actions that jointly build the entire journey. So that is, to me, is just a mindset difference that is between games and applications. So the other one is that, so part 2 now, moving from 1 to 2, is that once you appreciate that there's a system, there's this idea that games are fractal. Games are composed of games. The system is composed of systems. So you take this big idea and you break it down. And so one example of this is Frogger, a very old game from the 80s, which I think some of us might have played. And it really was a set of sub-games, right? The first game that you had was you could use the joystick to move back and forth. And it was the safe zone. You would never get hurt down here. And it was the first game was just learning how to move. And you go left, 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 right, and it would take a little, the jump would have to complete. So then you would learn there was a little bit of a delay. You couldn't go instantly. There was kind of a loping gait to it. So you kind of learned this simple game of movement. Then there was the ability of crossing the traffic, which was actually much simpler because this was a flat surface. You had another safe zone. And then you had the river, which not only had moving objects, but had a moving place. So this is a more challenging game. And then you had to land in these kind of lily pads, these docks. And because this always moved in the same direction, this one was really, really easy to get. This one was really, really hard to get. And so you kind of learned that there was an additional game here. So the reason why Raph uses this as this fractal idea is that in one screen you can see this idea of a game kind of within a game. But what I want to not avoid, though, and he was really adamant about this, is that it truly is fractal, not linear. It's not like to win the lever, you cross the street, cross the river, do it 5 times. It was much deeper than that. So the game is to win the level, the sub-game is to cross the street. But to cross the street, there was the sub-sub game of moving the frog. And the sub-sub game is understanding the joystick timing. And so each one of these things, now, by the time you get down to the understanding the joystick timing, it's a pretty trivial game. It's not like it's a gigantic, but his point is that game designers treat each of these as a game that you have to learn and understand and have feedback on. And they're quite rigorous about having feedback at each one of these levels to teach you each one of these skills. It's just it kind of boggles the mind that they actually care that much at each particular level. And as Raph was saying, most designers don't do this. It's just kind of the level of attention that great designers do. So each of these levels has their own game issues, motivation, feedback, and learning that they track and measure at each level. So again, the way we break this down is applications tend to stay high. They use UX guidelines. They use material design. They're like, hey, just follow these patterns. Don't color outside the lines. Just do what everyone else has done before. Games constantly go low. They explore the edges. It's about, in some ways, is being unique, being somewhat different, which maybe we can't do as much. But they're constantly saying, what is the edge of what's happening and how do we teach every step of the way? So it's not just a feature, but a reinforcing cascade of nested subtasks. The deeper you go, the more profound the effect is. So now, once we know, so again, started off with a system that created narrative, which was then fractally broken up. And now we're down to what each of these pieces are. This third thing is called the learning loop. And he uses this term from psychology. This is a well-known psychological term, so he was not trying to make anything new here. And the idea of the learning loop is that users have an intent, they take an action, and they see a result. And the reason why it's a loop is that the intent has some type of mental model. And when you start the game, that mental model is quite poor. But then once you actually do an action through some type of affordance, like there's a frog, and I have the affordance of the joystick, I have to learn how to move the frog, right? I try something, and then I get the feedback. And then once I get that feedback, it then goes back and it updates my mental model. So when I do Frogger, I hit the joystick, and I press and hold it, and they jump one time. I go, oh, it doesn't, there's a speed issue here. And if I go bump, 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 it jumps 3 particular times, and then I have to go back. So you're learning effectively all about this timing as you jump. So in the first 3 or 4 jumps, you've already started learning. You've already started kind of figuring out what was going on. And this is probably his biggest quote from the book. Fun is just another word for learning. He adamantly believes that fun games are games where you're learning something. Now, you may be learning how to shoot a bad guy. I'm not trying to say that you're necessarily learning Shakespeare here, but the point is you don't have fun for the heck of it. You do it because you're accomplishing something. You're getting better. There's a skill that's being developed. That's where I started to realize that I thought there was an awful lot in common between applications and games, because we fundamentally, about good design, are about learning, right? So, and his point though is that these loops are really critical. You start with a basic core mechanic that the game is about, and then you slowly grow that mechanic to do more and more things. So when you start off in Super Mario, this is the early one that maybe many of you have never played before, but the original game, you were behind this pipe, and all you could do was go back and forth. So the first game was movement, and it was a really boring game, right? So then you discovered the jump button. And the first couple of times you jumped, you missed. You just jumped around, and so finally you timed it right because of the feedback to jump on top of this thing. And now you were escaping game 1. So the first jump is just a simple jump. The first loop was just learning a simple jump. But as you then immediately passed this thing, you discovered this area of bricks with these question marks. And assuming you jumped, it was intentionally low. So when you jumped on it, you'd hit it, and then the mushroom would come out and you'd get big, right? And so they put in your path another thing to say, oh look, if I jump into something with a low ceiling, I can actuate, I can actually do something. And then by the time you get to your first monster, you've now learned jumping and timing, and I can actually do something. So here comes this monster, and you may die initially, but then you're like, well, wait a second, I've already learned an awful lot about jumping. Why don't I try jumping? And then you jump on top of this person, and it's this timed jump. And then so you just lead themselves. So it's all about jumping, right? And they just kind of on top of all that. So it's about moving, opening, and attacking. And what an application designer would do would give you an icon for moving, an icon for opening, an icon for jumping, right? We would just make them as separate features. They're like, no, it's all the same thing. I think that really is fascinating. So it's the same basic mechanic that grows over time, and Nintendo is an absolute master of this, right, as far as how they would do that. In fact, Miyamoto-san, he's the famous designer from Nintendo. He's revered in the industry. That's how we make games in Nintendo. We get the fundamentals solid first, then do as much with that core concept as our time and ambition will allow. And here's the part that really blew my mind. As for the courses and the enemies, the game, those actually came at the very end. They were done in a single burst of energy, just thrown together almost. I could not believe he said that. It's like, it's so important to get the jumping and these loops and how they build upon each other, that getting that right was much more important than the levels. And then they would because once they had that right, the levels kind of took care of themselves. Let's teach this loop, let's teach this loop, and they became quite clear. I thought that was really interesting. So in a sense, another psychological term is chunking, right? So you once you learn the simple jump, then jumping into, you can do more easily by pressing the jump button a little bit longer. That's kind of a higher jump, right? And eventually you do this timed jump. And so the example of chunking is that when you ask someone to break down how you put on a pair of pants, they go, I just put them on. Well, no, you grab one hand and this hand, and then you push. There's a whole series of subtasks that you do to put on a pair of pants. But with game design, as you go up these loops, you're like, oh, I just got the monster. You don't think about it as jumping anymore. You just took care of the monster. And so if you do loops right, users start to think in terms of these higher level functions, which also is quite interesting. And so this is such a powerful thing that Nintendo does this all the time. So Super Mario Odyssey, which is also an awesome game, by the way, it's really, does this, it's about jumping and throwing the hat. And they have many, many levels of jumping and many, many levels of throwing the hat. And what a surprise, you can throw the hat and jump, right? So they clearly have done many, many loops around that. Splatoon, if you've played that, is all about the paint. And it's all about how you can travel on your paint. In fact, to climb the wall, you paint it first. And because you can dive into the paint and go to other places. So to climb the wall, you paint the wall and you go through the paint to the wall. So they, again, deeply think that through. And then Luigi's Mansion, which is a game that almost no one's played, uses a vacuum cleaner. But again, it's an interesting technique. Now, again, a lot of this is good game design, but I still think this is quite inspirational from an application design, because we never, ever think about loops that can build upon each other. But at the same time, we did see examples of this with early computers. So with Windows, you had Minesweeper, and with Macintosh, they had a special boot disk on the Macintosh. Most people don't see these anymore because people had never used a mouse. And so what these things did was they taught you how to move and click and then drag and then use a menu and then shift click and then right click. These are the loops of the desktop interface, and these games literally taught it. It's really interesting that here we are, the descendants of the desktop revolution, and we've forgotten that they used games to teach us the very loops that they invented. So this was what really kind of cemented the world for me, is that we've used games to teach our very programs, but we seem to have forgotten it somehow. So, and to Raph's point, I completely agree with this. Desktop has a whole lot of better loops, a lot more expressive loops. So when you talk to people about getting more done on desktop, I hate it when the more modern mobile pundits claim that you're being a dinosaur, or that you don't get it, or you're being old-fashioned. there are serious reasons why desktop is significantly better than mobile. I'm not saying that mobile's a dead end. Mobile has clearly won. It's much bigger than desktop. But to say that mobile is better than desktop in every way is completely naive. And there's a whole lot of things that mobile could be doing because desktop just has so much more expressivity to it because of these loops. So we use multiple independent mechanics as a general principle of design in quote-unquote the real world. Games connect through one single mechanic. Now again, I'm not trying to say that we should design everything with a single mechanic. I'm just trying to say this is damn interesting. And what can we learn from this? And would we want to use pieces of this in the way we design our applications? So, creating a shared mechanic makes it not only fun, but allows users to learn advanced skills more easily. So, affordances and feedback. This is a classic issue of how games give feedback. My favorite example of this is Breath of the Wild. I will talk to you to death about Breath of the Wild. It is like, really, if you have not played this game, you must play this game. It is, just borrow it from a friend and play for a half an hour and you will thank me. It is really that good. Okay. So, the big innovation they had was this thing called the stamina wheel. And the stamina wheel was how long you could do something before you fell and were exhausted. So if you climbed a wall and the wheel emptied, you would fall, right? But they were so subtle when they did it. So if you're climbing a wall, the stamina wheel goes down. If you stop, the stamina wheel stops. Fine. If you go sideways, it stays the same. But what'll happen is if you stop, he leans back. And so that kind of visually tells you the stamina wheel is not going down. And if you go sideways, he's back. But when he climbs, he goes forward. So it's a very subtle thing about, oh, I'm going to visually, not only is this going to go down, but the character actually tells you when it's going down. Now, if you then climb this area, which is a little bit less at an angle, versus this very steep angle, in this area, he actually leans in and sweat drops come out of his head. And the stamina wheel goes down faster. Where if you go up the more slanted area, he leans back a little bit more, there's no more sweat drops, and it drops slower. They're teaching you about the second derivative of the function through feedback. I didn't even know this was happening, and I actually was learning how to take the less steep route up the mountain, and I didn't even know that they were doing this to me. This is like voodoo UX design, and it wasn't until Raph taught me about it that I even noticed it was happening. This is just total magic to me, and it worked. It totally worked on me. So there's a difference though between affordances. Basically, his point is they prompt the learning loop, things that you've already learned. So when you play almost any video game today, especially a console game, you'll walk up to something and there will be this take button. You will see this button probably 10,000 times when you play the game, right? And it's interesting is that they don't make it go away. Today, when you design an application, you do the prompt 1 or 2 times, you're like, oh, they got it. But games show it to you over and over and over again, right? And so that's just simply a take prompt. In the case of Arkham Asylum, Batman has this grappling gun, and you can kind of hit the grappling and then swing over to it, a little bit like Spider-Man. And what'll happen is they actually, once you've learned it, will actually do a little highlight with the RB, right button, and it'll tell you that you can grapple there, right? So this is something that is just there as a convenience. It's just there to let you know, and it's a very simple prompting of your existing skills. But some, though, are really subtle. So, not a surprise, I'm going to use Breath of the Wild again. When you are fighting this robot, here's the character right here, there's a point, a loop that they can teach you is that you can do a block. But if you do a block and jump backwards, you do this special cool move that gets extra points. But what happens is the robot swings wide, and it gives you this huge, it telegraphs what they're going to do. And when that happens, you then do the jump. So it's a subtle indication like, do this new loop now. The other one is just a visual loop, which is these walls are completely impenetrable. You can't do anything to them. Here's a little bomb that you can leave, but see these cracks in the wall? If you bomb this wall, it breaks apart, and there's a treasure behind it. So again, little subtle things, both what we'll call movement-based and graphical-based, that tell you there's things behind. This is what we do, right? We give you dialog boxes. It's like, we say, do this! Or worse yet, we give you those kind of like 3 dots and you swipe through all this. It's like, yes, of course, yeah. All you want to do is get rid of the damn thing because it's like in your face. So there's a big difference between the very direct things that we do and the very subtle things that games do. So, and so this is part of what we did. I just showed that we went through in his book, he has a checklist of all these types of feedback, and he uses this kind of feedback at every level of the fractal granularity and talks about the types of feedback you can do, when they can be used, how they can be used. This is all in his book. And so this was just an example of our conversation where I would list all of his categories. These were like my questions, these were like kind of his answers, and so we went through this in great detail. And what I will summarize for you is some of what we'll call the 5 big ones that we talk about. The first one is contextual feedback. So is the feedback relevant to the area that you're in? So with Breath of the Wild, you will actually have your footsteps sound different in the snow than they do inside of a dungeon versus outside. It sounds like a very atmospheric thing, but it's kind of that level of detail as to how you let people know where they are. There's also this multivariable feedback. This is probably the most subtle thing. Super Mario Brothers is a master at this, which is to say, while you're running, Mario will do different actions. And so, for example, when he gets to be running fast enough, his hands fly out. And that basically indicates more than 10 miles an hour, right? They could have had a speedometer, but they didn't. They just said, when the hands go out, you've now reached the speed to do this next level loop. They also have like smoke trails that indicate kind of your direction or your turn. They have the grass, they have the sand that goes up. They actually are embedding multiple types of feedback, speed, velocity, second velocity, all in this feedback that's incredibly subtle that kind of you just pick up on. You just kind of go, oh, he's going to the left now, he's drifting, oh, that kind of stuff. So the next question is more of a question about does it match reality? And this maybe applies more to games, but like games really obsess over whether or not they use the trigger, which obviously applies to guns, is this the trivial example, versus the analog joystick versus the digital joystick. And there's a big difference between how these two behave. And they have big arguments over whether or not you use the digital or the analog joystick. I'm not quite sure how that quite applies to us, but unless we want to talk about scrolling versus tapping versus dragging. So we could kind of, that might be the way to think about that. The problem I have is that we on mobile don't have this range of richness, especially compared to desktop. We've got pinch, we've got tap, because we've got a flat piece of glass. Isn't one of your projects called Breaking the Glass? I think it's just the same. Like, this is not that interesting. These are very primitive user interface tools. I'm actually working on a project, which I'm happy to show some of you guys later, about trying to reinvent how we are doing low-level text editing. You have to sign an NDA, but we'll talk about that later. But the idea is that we are trying to do some very clever and subtle things about how you highlight and move text. But to do that, we have to use these very primitive tools, and we would love to have something a little bit more expressive, and you can't really do that. So the only trick we have is this idea of press and hold. And that is a hack. It is a total hack. And sorry, I just have to kind of do my old man Simpson here. That we would love to have more expressive types of pressure gestures, and I guess there's some work in the literature about doing rolling gestures. We talked about that this morning about the way up and down. So I would argue there's much more that we can do that would allow the user to have more interesting loops. So multiple types of feedback is this idea of having visual feedback, audio feedback, haptic feedback, multiple ways, and so often we just simply highlight the button. And if we're really lucky, we'll do a beep sound. But we don't talk about the fact that there's multiple levels of feedback that you can do. And that's what games really work at. They try to have all three if at all possible. And then does it mix, this is really an interesting one. Does it mix styles, emphasis, and focus? So let me give you an example of that. This is Horizon Zero Dawn. And it's about a fallen civilization that's quite primitive. And yet they've still found advanced remnants of advanced technology. So the entire UI is done from the perspective of this character, and it's all done with like the equivalent of cave paintings, right? So it's a very cave painting-ish style. But anytime you see something in the environment, it has a very sharp, crisp, scientific look to it. So you quickly then can distinguish between what is part of the environment and what is my HUD versus what are specific things, and it causes them to stand out. Another example that Raph gave me was that Mario and all of his friends are rounded characters, very bulbous, big noses, okay, whereas all of his enemies are sharp, jagged characters. again, a stylistic difference that you don't even think about, but quickly, you just look at a character and you instantly know that they're a bad guy based on these kinds of things. So these are just simple user interface elements that allow you to kind of intuit what is happening and how things are divided up. The same argument can be applied. How do we drive this to the cognitive level? So again, with material design, we've got titles and so forth, but how do we then call about the navigational level? How do we want to then augment that so people can see that this is the more important, of all these panes, this pane is more important than other panes? And would we have a stylistic difference? So let me give you an example of how we could do this. I'm sorry, I want to finish with grace notes, and then I'll give some examples. He really loves this idea of grace notes, and grace notes are feedback for fun. They're not meant to teach. They're meant to tell you that the system takes you seriously. So the example here would be in Breath of the Wild, you can run through the grass. And not only does the grass move, but like grasshoppers will fly out, right? So you don't have to know anything about that. And it's not just simply window dressing, it's to let you know that there's stuff to this world. Later on, what you realize is there's a technique you can use to cut the grass. And when you do that, the cricket that would have flown up is actually in the grass, and you can actually catch them. So you can't catch them when you run through. That's just a grace note. But it hints at this deeper level, and then when you advance to this next level, you can then take advantage of it. In Half-Life 2, you can flush the toilets. It doesn't do a damn thing. But what it means is that you can interact with the environment. So when you walk up to a panel, you've flushed a toilet, maybe the panel does something. So it's like this promise. It's like, hey, we've taken the time to make silly things work. Try, go do other things. So it's considered to be a very critical part of game design to have useless grace notes, because it lets you know that the world actually works. So remember that list of tricks I wanted to avoid? Well, this is where most of them would come from. So we could spend an awful lot of time talking about affordance and so forth, and that's perfectly fine. It's just simply this idea that it's not the flashy trick that matters, but the rigorous application of multiple types of feedbacks in both important and trivial ways. And to me, that was the higher level learning, is that, yes, we could talk, I'd be happy to talk about this feedback mechanism, but it's the fact that you rigorously applied it to this cascading fractal breakdown that I think is really interesting. So games work hard to find ways to show, hint, reveal, and explain. Apps fall back on style guides for good reason. Google, we should be looking further. This is not just the status quo, but exploring new, deeper techniques. So what I'm saying here is that with application design, we tend to prompt as little as possible. We are deathly afraid of prompting. Whereas with games, they just prompt all the damn time. They actually make an art of prompting. So, and how is it that games get away with prompting all the time? Well, they're far more subtle than we are. So, that's about affordances. They aren't all or nothing. There's a range of direct and subtle cues. Hintiness, though, is a word I'm very proud to say that I made up. I actually added something to this conversation. I just didn't steal from Raph the whole time. And it was this idea that affordances tell you what you know. Hintiness tells you what you should know. It's the way you move from one loop to the next. The classic example here is Breath of the Wild, where there's a certain puzzle and you've got to get through this misty forest, and you've got to figure out how to do it. I don't want to give it away. It's kind of fun, but it all deals with how you pay attention to this torch. And there's a very subtle feedback in the torch that gives you this hint as to how to get through it. Now that's really subtle, and it's part of the game, but we could do more than that. So affordances are not the same as hintiness. Affordances reinforce the loop you're on, hints move you to a new loop. It's kind of like trying to avoid Clippy, right? Clippy was this horrible, in-your-face, hey! And you're like, shut the fuck up. It was just like, yeah, I got that. We're trying to be a lot more subtle than Clippy. So in navigation, there was this thing that Disney used, a term I had never heard before called weenies. It seems like a very strange word. Weenies is a very old-fashioned word in American English. I don't know if you guys even have it. It was a slang word for hot dog. Nobody uses the word today, but it was actually fairly common in the 50s. And the reason why he used the word weenie was that he would use a hot dog to get his dog to follow him anywhere in the house. That was like the ultimate treat for the dog. He had hot dogs, or weenies, in Disneyland. It was an absolutely cardinal rule that when you were in the main area of one land of Disneyland, you could always see one aspect of the other land. You always had this hot dog that could pull you out. It was absolutely critical. Every land had you see another part of the land. And so it was because it gave you that kind of sense of orientation. Where am I? How do I get out of here? How do I move? And it was, I did not realize it was like that critical to the way they designed their park. Games do this as well. And a good example in Super Mario is moon chains. They have one level is to get just through one goal is to get through the level. But you have the secondary goal of collecting as many of these moons as possible. But in Super Mario Odyssey, they always make sure that you can always see that. So they give you this challenge to get rid of this guy. And by the way, after you're done with this, you want to get this. But they carry it to even another level. Usually when you're at that moon, you can see the next moon. Now that next moon may be really far away, but they always make sure that you can always see the next moon. And that gives you your weenie to say, oh, I should probably be going in that direction. It's really brilliant game design. And to a certain extent, good loops are hints. They're all about the fact that as you learn this loop and all these feedbacks, it just tempts you to say, what's the next loop? Where should I be going next? So the big issue with hintiness, and it's really critical in game design, and this is where most games, Raph was saying, fail, is they avoid bottom feeding. And the example here is that you're in this is World of Warcraft, but you're in some game and you're really good at killing spiders. And you've developed to a certain point, you kill spiders all the time. And then you go to the next level and there's like an alligator, but he's really hard. He kills you right away because you haven't learned your next thing. So guess what? You just kill spiders all day, right? And that's called bottom feeding. And what happens is if you do that, you get bored and you quit the game. So it's about getting that play level right. And hintiness is about giving you the hint to get to that next skill. You need to learn the next loop to kill the alligator. You can't kill the alligator with spider skills. You need to learn the next loop to kill the alligator. And that's where the learning and the fun occurs. So bottom feeding kills games. And so our challenge is what's bottom feeding for Android. So let me give you an example here of hintiness. This is an old picture. I had to go back to an old, it's hard to write. This is Photoshop. And Photoshop has the ability to have guides. And you would drag this guide out and things snap to it. So the level 1 loop to do that is to go to the menu and to say new guide, have a dialog box, give it a position and hit OK, and it appears. And so when you first do Photoshop, this is how you have to do it. Now eventually someone teaches you that you can click and you can drag it out. That's the kind of the level 2 way of doing it. But you have to have someone tell it to you. Well, what you could do, if you wanted to use and this is an example of game design where you could say, oh, look, every time you do it this way, don't just go bing, but do a where it actually would slide out. It takes 150 milliseconds. It doesn't even slow you down at all. You hardly even notice it. But it clearly, and in fact, if you're really clever, you might just do kind of a little sparkle here and then an animation. So you'd say, hey, if you clicked here and dragged it, you could do the same thing. And again, what about games is they don't care if you get it right away. They clearly want to test it, but you may see it 30 times. And eventually you go, oh, maybe I can go, oh, right, hey, cool. So that's, to me, the issue about games. They're patient, and they're subtle, and they're repetitive. So we tend to assume constant skill level. This is what you know, and if you don't know it, we're going to tell you in a bunch of dialog boxes. Okay? Where hinting is about, the whole point is to get you to the next level. We're going to design this thing to teach you. And again, I find that to be really inspiring. It's like, how do you build your application with the intent of teaching them, right? So, but really, really sneaky, subtle hints. So hintiness effectively prevents bottom feeding. So pacing is the last point we'd make, and this is the opening scene of Breath of the Wild. And when you talk about pacing, you usually are talking about the classic exposition things where you learn, you get more complicated, it gets hard, then you have the boss and you go back down again. And I don't want to, there's a big element of that of games, but to me, the critical thing that he talked about was games take the long view. And from pacing, the point is how do you pace that first step? So remember that arc, and when you wanted to go, they really focus on this. What is the first thing we want you to learn? And it's about saying, hey, just take that first step. We don't want to teach you everything. We'll get there with hintiness and loops. Just take the first step. And so I'm not sure this will work. I'm afraid this won't play very well. This is a video of the Flash talking to Batman, and Flash is freaking out. And Batman says, just save one. He goes, what do you mean? Just go in, get a person out, and come back out. He goes, what's then? What next, Batman? He goes, you'll know. And it's a really simple point, which is like, just get in there and save one thing, and then you'll be fine. Okay? And this actually was discussed by Luke Grabowski, someone I work with at Google, and it was talking about the fact that we see this happen all the time with applications. When the first time you load an application, they have this kind of acetate that says, let me tell you everything about this application. Here's this, and you're like, just get the. People have tried this over and over and over again. And what happened was there was one company that tried this multiple times, failed. They finally realized that this was some type of financial application, and what they realized is the first step was to create a financial transaction. So they simplified the whole thing down to say, hey, here's the one thing you need to know. Here's how Flash saves one person. Just make a financial transaction. And once you just did that, everything else kind of came from there. You made that thing, then the list showed up, and you saw that they were there, and then you could click on them and open them up. And it was like very clear that just taking that first step is a really interesting problem to break people down. So in a sense, applications kind of go, here's a toolbox of 18 icons. Which one do you want? Where games kind of go, do this. Just start here. So here's the 6 things. How are we doing for time, by the way? A little time? So I want to quickly go through. So to me, what I love about this is that the way these things break down is that the first one talks about thinking in arcs, from big to small, to create a core mechanic. And this is about how you break the problem down. These 3 are how you build it back up again. Prompt your known loops, move to new loops, and make sure you start with this loop. And so to me, I love that Raph kind of created this system that broke it down and then built it back up again. I found a lot of really interest in that. So what I'd like to do then is to switch to Android and to try to go through, if we have enough time, to go through a couple of examples of how we could actually use this actually versus just talking about games are cool, right? So think in terms of standalone features versus higher level arcs. So this is the new animation that Google used for startup. And what they did was, initially, we had an animation for boot, and it was all sorts. If you've been following Android, they've been all over the map, from insanely goofy to very subtle. And then there was a separate animation for when you actually did the Android setup. And what we finally did is we realized we had to tell a story. So the boot animation dovetailed with the setup animation, and it was completely seamless. You actually didn't know that there was a break. There were 2 different animations. And then once you actually did this setup flow, you would see this animation, and it would just take you to the home screen. So it's a small issue about making sure that all the pieces of Android are actually connected together and tell this. It's very similar to what the Macintosh did, by the way, as far as telling a unified story. So this was like one small thing that we did. The other one is just simply the fact that with Pixel now, when you plug it in, it just makes a lovely little sound. Not only do you get the little icon in the corner that you're charging, but you get this kind of chime. And again, it's about kind of having multiple types of feedback to say, we got it, we're charging. We're kind of this is the story that we're telling about you plugging in your cable. Subtle, small points. This is a video that we can't really show. It's hard to show with audio, but this was a setup screen for Android TV. And before, it was kind of every time you'd go from screen to screen, it'd be like, tick, tick, tick. It'd just simply be the simple little thing. And you didn't know where you were, you weren't quite, and then what they changed it to was a very subtle form of kind of elevator music that was just playing in the background, kind of calm, because you were now on this journey. And as you would move, it was this very subtle movement. And then when you were done, the music would die down. So it used very subtle sound to tie the experience into one flow. And it was very powerful, and people actually made it through a little bit more effectively. So the other one is about games or fractals, reminding you that apps stay at the high level, games go low. So in this particular case, when you want to do a notification, right, you would pull down. The first game is that you notice that you have a notification. The second game is that you pull it down, and then it reveals the notification. The third game is to dismiss it. And then the fourth one is to actually customize, which is to kind of manage it. So there's multiple levels to this game that we could play. But we have to realize, well, what's our mechanic for it? So remember, it's fractal, not linear, in the sense that what I'm saying here is, remember fractal? What I'm talking about here is that when we start talking about how we break it down, there's like this gesture this way, and there's this gesture this way, but to customize it, you have to do it partially. And I think it's really important to realize that these are sub-pieces of the same gesture. So what I'm referring to here is that we've got, in effect, 3 separate mechanics for the same basic thing. And I think this is an opportunity for us to think about how we could kind of unify them a little bit. So oh, I'm sorry. What I was referring to here is that I would argue that it's, when we talked about the loops, about how you kind of pull things down and dismiss them, we're missing a whole series of opportunities to kind of unify these things and how we would actually want to change the way the mechanic is done or have feedback to kind of do it in different directions. And I just realized that I skipped a slide because it's talking about a future direction. So what I want to do is just refer to the fact that there's just a way of thinking about this particular direction that is very important for us to kind of, well, pull the mechanic apart. So I can talk about this one a little bit later. So what I'm trying to do here is to talk about what the ways in which we could do. Effectively, we're doing the same thing. We're noticing something, we're targeting it, and we're dragging it. And so what I'm referring to here, sorry, just give me a second. If you don't mind, I'm going to skip this particular one because it goes into a little bit too much detail. But the bottom line is, once you realize that you have a drag loop and a reveal loop, and games try to build upon that, it just asks a certain series of questions about how you would like to effectively reveal things, animate things, and then hint at things. And so once you say, well, wait a second, how can we build all of this? Reveal and cancel and expose, how would those all be done in the same way? You start asking very repetitive questions, and you start, for example, using maybe if there's a certain graphic on the title bar that maybe wiggles in some particular way to get you to notice it, maybe that same wiggle, that same animation happens at the bottom to get you to reveal it. And so it's about tying all these things together. So there's a whole series of explorations that we can do. And so games motivate that discussion to say, build this all in the same swipe experience, which includes the visual and the animation and the actual action itself. Let's leave it at that. And of course, the other issue here is about prompting as little as possible. This is the ghost of Clippy all over again, about how do we avoid this prompting. So why are games so good at this prompting? And the main reason why is they're subtle and they're patient. We are obvious and hit you over the head. So now we're going to go back to this conversation I talked about 6 different levels of affordances to talk about it, and to use the example of settings. So this is the new version of settings in Android P, and we've significantly cleaned it up. So now each particular setting has our own color icon, very unique icon. This really helps quite a bit to break things up. But once you then go into each individual ones, they're exactly the same. It's not really clear that this is level 2, this is level 3, and this is level 4. Right? So if we were to go back to these same 6 I talked about, by the way, this is purely a graphical exploration. This is not a future direction. This is just something that we could kind of use game theory to talk about. How could we use these types of feedback to give you a better understanding of where you are in settings? And these are just meant to be examples. So in the case of story, right, is this feedback contextual? Right? Do you kind of know where you are? So for example, we have a color for every icon. What would happen if every single title had effectively a deeper and deeper color? So as you got deeper and deeper in the level, the title actually changed. Subtle, small thing, but it just got darker and darker as you got down. I'm not really sure we can use physical controls, but multiple types of feedback. How does the sound get deeper? Every time you go down a level, it goes tick, tick, tick. And so that, again, it reinforces the color. Multiple feedbacks for the exact same thing. And then effectively, does it mix styles and emphasis? This is, remember with the Horizon Zero Dawn, they mixed the chalk drawings and the scientific ones. Do we want to have a very strong title difference versus content level, so that with the two, when you have the title difference from the content difference, you can put all the feedback into the title and it draws attention to it a little bit more. And the grace notes would be more of the fun things, which is to say, if you've turned on developer options in Android, you got to tap multiple times. Maybe the background changes to a dungeon or things like that. So again, small little things that let you know the system pays attention. So part of what I think this causes us to do is to take something as simple as opening up a series of dialogue panels and to say, how do we use multiple types of visual, audio, and kind of animation feedback to kind of reinforce where you are. It's a level of detail we don't normally do, but it's something I think we should be exploring more. And the hintiness is this idea of, like right now, for example, when you first launch Android P, it does this little bounce, which is meant to show you that you can swipe up. I think it's a brilliant little idea. I like it, but we don't have this confidence to keep it around the whole time. Once you swipe up twice, it's gone forever. I would argue that we should actually consider making this maybe a little bit more subtle, or maybe kind of have a different version of it, so that it always does it. And that's what a game would do. A game says, we're so proud of this hintiness, we're gonna do it to you all the time. And so I would argue that it's a good start. We can do a little bit more. If you're familiar with this idea that right now on Android, if you tap on this button, it does a couple of things. If you just tap on it, you get Google Assistant, but if you drag to the side, it moves you between various applications. And so the problem here is that we're getting, this is a critique of what we're doing today, it gives you the affordance that you'll bring up Assistant. But if you drag it, you get something else. So this is kind of a miss for us right now, that we aren't kind of really doing the two together. And so what I would argue is if you wanted to have some feedback, if you tapped on it, it would be an arrow that would show you that you could drag it. So again, a simple visual bug that we could fix by using just basic kind of hintiness feedback. So the pacing issue is, again, learn this first. This is actually something that is done, well, one of the biggest challenges people have in learning a smartphone is how to install an application. And if you break it up into sub pieces, it's like, what are an application? How do I get one? How do I find one? How do I install it? If you ask someone to install like a solitaire game on your phone, it's insane. There's like 700 versions of solitaire. So there's a problem with app stores right now. But just the idea of getting someone started, what would happen if we had some type of visual affordance that was a plus? And the reason why I chose this is that Samsung does this today in kind of a poor way. They do it for their folders, but not for applications. But if you had this affordance on the home screen, you'd be like, oh, I want to add something to the home screen, and then you tap it. And now you're in a special context. You tap on this, it opens up the App Store for you. So it is effectively just a shortcut to the App Store, but from this context of adding something. So it might put on some training wheels and say, welcome to the App Store. We're going to tell you a little bit about it. Here's a couple of apps that you might want to install. We might give you a short list. So it's not just the App Store. It's like this idea of getting started, just getting things going. And this would be a whole different way of looking at the App Store versus kind of like, you know what? You figure out where it is, you find it, you launch it, and good luck finding something. So this is the kind of idea that's a very simple, tiny thing that could kind of start you down this. It's like pushing a domino, and then the thing started falling down. So I gave you a couple of very quick Android examples. I think there's so much more we could talk about, but these are basically the 6. Do I have any more? Again, the summary of what they all mean. So I found an awful lot of interest in this. I feel like there's an awful lot more to talk about. I've actually started taking apps in Android and redesigning them with these in mind, but I'm running out of time, and we'll talk about this later. So at this point, I think we're done, and I'd love to keep talking to you guys about it. So thank you very much, and I'd like to take some questions if we have some time.